Hi there. Here we are, on to lesson 8. So we finally concluded our 4-part study of the ancient Greeks, and now you're very familiar with ancient Greek culture. I hope you enjoyed reading the Iliad and the Odyssey and the great selection of Athenian drama we went over in the last couple lectures, as well as Sappho and Aesop's fables. A lot of good stuff came out of ancient Greece. Now, for the final 2 lectures, we're turning our attention to the other famous empire from the ancient world, the Roman Empire. So we're going to look at 2 works of epic poetry. First up in this lecture is the Aeneid, which is very similar in many ways, although with some differences to the Iliad and the Odyssey and Gilgamesh and the other epic poems we've read so far. There's this big, sprawling narrative epic that tells of the founding of a nation. So it's an exciting text to take a look at here as we near the end of the quarter. In the second half of this lecture, we will look at a poet, as we did a couple lectures ago when we looked at the Odyssey and then turned our attention to Sappho. So looking at that, a longer text and then some short poetry. And in part 2 of lesson 8, we will look at Catullus, the ancient Roman poet, who has actually a lot of parallels to Sappho. So it should be quite a fun lecture. Next time in our final lecture, lesson 9, we'll look at the Metamorphoses by Ovid, which is technically speaking epic poetry because it's long narrative poetry from the ancient world, but it's much more episodic. It's a collection of short episodes. So almost like a collection of short stories in verse form. So that'll be really fun and interesting next time around. And will let us look at something a little bit different before we wrap up the course. But here we're taking our last look at one of these epic texts. And the Aeneid is quite the fascinating text. So I'm very glad we get to study it here. And the one other thing I'll mention before we get started is because we're immersing ourselves these last 2 lessons in a culture we have not studied yet, ancient Rome, some of this lecture, some of the background and context at the beginning of the lecture in particular, will be familiarizing ourselves with the Roman culture, the culture of the Roman Empire. At this point, we're very familiar with Greek culture and what it was like to live in ancient Greece. I want to, with these last 2 lessons, give you some insight to what it would have been like to live in ancient Rome. And I want to do that here more so in the first of the 2 lectures so that you have that context going into the rest of the lecture and reading. Here's a scene from the Aeneid. It's a famous scene. If you've read it already from book 2, the fall of Troy. Oh my gosh, one of the most powerful things for me when I read the Aeneid is seeing the fall of Troy. We know about it from mythology. I mean, we talked already when we were studying Greece about how the Greek culture is very familiar in our current culture. We've heard of Achilles' heel and we've heard of the Trojan horse. But the Iliad doesn't depict those things. We don't actually see the fall of Troy. And so to see it described here in the Aeneid is, I think, truly remarkable. And you have it not just here present in the Aeneid, but from the perspective of a Trojan. So someone who was fleeing for his life and trying to save his family as the city was burning around him. And it's amazing how in book 2 of the Aeneid, you can have a language that's so poetic and so beautiful, but that's describing something as horrible as the destruction of a city. And here you have in this picture Aeneas with his wife and his son and carrying his father, as you remember from book 2. So it's quite the powerful image, and I thought a good way to start off our discussion of this classic text. So first off, as always, recall. Here's the point where you can check out these questions and pause the lecture and jot down some things. And I would say, what are some major themes from the Iliad and what are some major themes from the Odyssey would be the ideal questions to launch us into our discussion of the Aeneid. And you'll see why as we get closer. But the Romans borrowed heavily from the ancient Greeks. And Virgil, the author here in particular, borrowed heavily from Homer. And the Aeneid is considered like the founding work, the national epic of Rome. It and Rome are permanently intertwined. Um, the greatest work of Roman literature, most scholars say. And so, seeing where it came from by reviewing what we've studied already is a great way in. If we were meeting in a physical classroom, I would just go to the whiteboard and start listing off things with the pen on the whiteboard of what you remember from the Iliad and the Odyssey, because Virgil was a huge fanboy. He loved Homer, and as you'll see in a minute, the Aeneid is like the first work of fan fiction, which is really interesting. But obviously, it also diverges from Homer and from the Greek culture and the Greek literature in some ways. And so we'll also see those differences as well as those similarities. But the similarities are a decent place to start. Like I said, a way in. So take a few minutes and try to recall those, and then I'll pause the lecture and carry on. I'm so sorry. These should be bullet points coming in one at a time. I don't know what happened here. So do your best, I guess, to follow along. But like I said, we're going to go over not just Virgil, but also Rome, as it says here in the title. So Virgil was born in a rural part of northern Italy, and his early poetry really shows an appreciation for the countryside where he grew up, which is kind of unique because, like with Greece, the Greek works focus so much on the city, right? Like Athens and Sparta were these major city-states. And so this is one difference we see already. All of his poetry, though, all of it, even the short poems, focus on the human struggle to build a home in near impossible conditions. And that's really what the Aeneid is about, right? Virgil Aeneas, the protagonist of the Aeneid, loses his home when Troy is destroyed by the Greeks, and he sails around the Mediterranean and tries to find a place to build a new home. And so this is a universal theme to which we can all relate. It's the driving force, the central conflict of the Aeneid. That's what this text is about, and this is what moves the plot forward. But it was something that Virgil focused on in all of his writing, not just the Aeneid. And part of the reason for this is that during Virgil's life, the Roman Empire was constantly expanding. And so there was instability at home. As Rome was going out and conquering and taking over other countries, like, for instance, Carthage, so many resources devoted to these overseas wars, you didn't have a lot of stability at home. And so that's why Virgil, in part, one of the reasons why Virgil focuses so much on what it means and what it entails to build a home. Okay, so we don't really know that much about Virgil and his biography. So we've got 3 bullet points there to kind of give you an impression of what Virgil was like and what he focused on in his writing. These other 5 or so bullet points here all focus on the Roman Empire more generally, like I said, to kind of help immerse you into Rome as we start off the sequence of these last 2 lectures. And so the most important Roman word to know is pietas, like where we get our modern day word in modern English, piety, which in ancient Rome meant duty. And the Romans spoke Latin, so a lot of our words today have Latinate roots, and that's why it looks like piety. And so this was the most central core value of the Roman Empire. So if you think of the Greeks as kind of an example to illustrate this point, if you had to pick one word to sum up the Greek Empire, I would pick the word fate, right? You think about the Iliad, Achilles' choice to go back into battle, his fate to die young gloriously in battle. No matter how long he stays out of the war, he can't ignore his fate. Or Oedipus, he can't escape his fate. He tries to, and he ironically runs right towards it. So the Greeks, you could say, were a fatalistic culture. They believed that People had will and could make choices and actions, but all of it ultimately led to what was already fated by the gods. And that was in part, several reasons, but one of the main reasons being to show the devotion to the gods the Greek people thought they should have. And Homer's works reflect those values. So think of fate with the ancient Greeks, and then think of how the Romans borrowed so much from the ancient Greeks. Virgil, incredibly influenced by Homer. One example. Another example, the Romans took the Greek gods and just changed their names to planets. So Zeus became Jupiter, Jove for short. Poseidon became Neptune, so on and so forth. So the Romans have borrowed heavily from the Greeks. But to come back to the main point here, what did they borrow when it came to fate? Were they fatalistic like the Greeks? Well, they kind of took the concept of fate and adapted it to something else. And what they adapted it to was this concept here, pietas, or duty. And so allegiance to the empire, doing your duty, was so very important. It was the most important core value to the ancient Romans. And so it's a little bit different than fate. With fate, no matter what you do, the same outcome that has been fated will play out. You can't change the outcome of things. With pietas or duty, there's a little more free will. You could go against what you're supposed to do or called to do, but if you go against that, if you go against what you're supposed to do, you're undertaking the most grave dishonor. It would be the worst possible thing. So it still shows kind of the lack of choices or options available to someone, but it reframes or recasts the way people access those choices. Rather than being an inescapable fate, it's an inescapable duty. You are compelled to do something. But theoretically speaking, you could make a different choice, as dishonorable or difficult as that would be. And so you can see how the concept has been adapted a little, but how the cultures are very similar in many ways. And so what you might be asking right now is, why duty? Why pietas? Why, of all the things to borrow or adapt from the Greeks, why go in that particular direction? Well, these last 4 bullet points will answer that. So Rome was a republic for a long time, but during or shortly before Virgil's life, it shifted power to Julius Caesar, who was the first dictator. So it went from being kind of like a republic with a democracy, a little bit like Athens, to having a dictator with Julius Caesar. Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, which led to a decade or more of civil wars until 12 years after Caesar's assassination, his adopted great-nephew Octavian defeated Antony and Cleopatra and took control of Rome. So Antony and Cleopatra, they were lovers. They wanted to rule Rome. And they were there was a power vacuum when Caesar was assassinated. And so Antony and Cleopatra were trying to seize power, but they weren't successful. There was a lot of wars, 12 years of civil war for who would control Rome after Caesar's death. And ultimately, Caesar's great-nephew Octavian was victorious and became the ruler. Octavian was very concerned with his public image. He really cared what people thought of him, so he styled himself or called himself Augustus. That's a name he thought would be more appealing to people than Octavian, and wanted to promote himself as not a dictator. He wanted to at least appear to be the opposite of Caesar. And so he claimed Rome was becoming a republic again, and it was certainly different than when Caesar was ruler, but it was still singular rule. He was still, the only ruler. And so he presented himself in one way. And I'm not going so far as to say he was a hypocrite, but it was definitely not quite what he was saying. There wasn't a voting democracy like when it was still a republic before Caesar. But he was definitely different than Caesar, but he presented himself in this way. And so here we take all these things I've just said and connect them to duty and connect them to the Aeneid. And so Virgil, the author here, the poet, lived during Octavian's lifetime. And he was a well-known poet. Like I said, he had these short poems about the countryside in northern Italy, and that had made him famous, those poems. And so Octavian was looking for a good poet to enhance his image once he became Augustus, and he commissioned Virgil to compose the Aeneid as a national epic to glorify Augustan Rome. That's a quote from the introduction in the textbook to the Aeneid, and it's a really important sentence. He commissioned Virgil to compose the Aeneid as a national epic to glorify Augustan Rome. So epics like Gilgamesh and the Iliad and the Odyssey had always had this national focus, right? Like Gilgamesh is very much about him and about Uruk and how he rules the city, and how through his adventures and his interactions with Enkidu, he becomes a better ruler. The Iliad, in many ways, is about the fall of Troy, and the Odyssey is about Odysseus returning home to reclaim the throne and rule Ithaca and raise it up in the right way. So Virgil kind of takes that theme of nation, which was kind of a nascent theme in the Greek and earlier epics, an underdeveloped theme, though clearly present, and makes that all of what the Aeneid is about, makes that the central focus. So like I said earlier, building a home in near impossible conditions is about the founding of Rome. You can very much sum up the Aeneid as the story that tells of the mythological founding of Rome. And so Octavian or Augustus wanted Virgil to present Rome in a very certain way that would glorify him and glorify the empire. And so some scholars, some readers have called this work, the Aeneid, like propaganda and thrown around other words like that. And to a certain extent it is. I mean, what they're saying is not a far cry, but this is still a very impressive work of literature. And certainly this puffing up of Augustan Rome was not Virgil's only objective in composing it, and he has given us, like I said, a beautiful, heart-wrenching, powerful story. But it's important to know, hold that loosely, because it's important to know where it came from and what the goals were. And so it all comes back to this idea of duty, right? Because Rome, during the time of Virgil, had some kind of singular rule, right? From Caesar, I guess with an interlude of 12 years of war, and then Augustus. Figures who were very focused on their public image and who came to be emblematic of the empire over which they ruled. And so duty, allegiance to the empire was incredibly important. In a way here that's different from ancient Greece. The Greeks, being fatalistic, focused more on the gods. And the gods were very important to the Romans, as you can clearly see in reading the Aeneid. But they focused more, I think, on allegiance to the ruler rather than on allegiance to the gods, which is why it shifts from fate to duty. Because with the Greeks, you had all these different city-states. There wasn't like one unified Greek body. Like I mentioned in the previous lecture, Sparta and Athens were like almost their own empires within the Greek Empire, whereas Rome, especially during Virgil's lifetime, had this very singular rule, and it was much more knit together, the entire empire. So this emphasis on duty was just a natural fit, a natural thing the emperors pushed for. And the Aeneid is a text that does many things well, but one of them it clearly does is try to convince people to follow their duties. But it's not that simple. It also shows the cost of following one's duty to the emperor so closely. And so I think it's a text that, while it does spread the message that the emperor who commissioned its composition wants it to spread, it also, if just in subtle ways, kind of critiques, challenges, or at least makes us think about that message. And so it's going to be a really interesting text to look at. And so there's a little bit of background on ancient Rome. Hopefully it's insightful and helpful as we read. So reading questions, I really just have one. And it comes back to this idea of how the Greeks borrowed so heavily, the Romans borrowed so heavily from the Greeks, Virgil in particular from Homer. And so it was just to, as you read, take note of what seems similar from Homer and what seems different. Kind of building on the recall questions, if you've got some things listed out from the Iliad and the Odyssey, which of those things do you see in the Aeneid? And where does it maybe kind of diverge from those things? So hopefully this was helpful to think about as you read. It's definitely going to inform the rest of our discussion here as we get to the content of the poem. So just as I did with the Iliad and the Odyssey, I want to give you a plot overview here to help you kind of put events in perspective, because we don't have time to read the entire poem. As with Gilgamesh and the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's quite long. But we've read a good chunk of it. So hopefully kind of seeing this plot outline will put things in perspective. And a couple of things to note before we get too far here is this epic poem has 12 books rather than 24. So the books, or which are kind of like chapters in a novel, are twice as long as they were in the Iliad and the Odyssey. And it's very clearly divided in half. Much as the Odyssey, half of it was Odysseus' journey home, and half of it was reclaiming his home. The Aeneid follows a very similar plot structure, and so that's just one of the many things Virgil has borrowed from Homer. And one difference I would say is with the Odyssey, we read the books, the first half, that dealt with his journey home. But in terms of scholarly reception and the text's lasting appeal, both halves, you could say, of the Odyssey, the journey home and the battle to reclaim the home, are on pretty equal footing. The monsters and things from the first half of the Odyssey have become more famous in pop culture, but scholars and readers and fans of Homer still really derive a lot of value from books 13 to 24. That's not quite as true, at least not to the same extent, with the Aeneid. Books 1 through 6 are the journey, are really where people think that the true greatness of the Aeneid lies. And books 7 through 12, while interesting and dynamic, are just not quite revered in the same way as books 1 through 6 of the Aeneid or books 13 to 24 of the Odyssey. But it's a really similar structure where the first half is the journey and the second half is the home. And so both of them, the first half is the journey through the Mediterranean, which back then was called the Aegean Sea. And the second half in the Odyssey is reclaiming the home. And in the Aeneid, it's building the home for the first time. But it's a man who's lost his prior home. It's not his first home. So it really connects to the Odyssey in a lot of ways. But here's the plot overview. So like I said, books 1 through 6 are the journey to Italy. And for our class, we read book 1, which introduces Aeneas. I love how this poem starts, and I love the introduction to him. And we hear about Juno, the goddess, her anger at Aeneas. So it kind of reminds you, right, of Poseidon from the Odyssey, and how they eventually land in Carthage for safe haven. And then book 1 ends, and book 2 begins with Aeneas telling Dido, the queen of Carthage, his story. So it's very similar to the Odyssey, where you have a character who's thrown about and rocked about the Mediterranean, but the book doesn't open with the poem as a whole, doesn't open with that journey and tell it in chronological order. It opens with where the character has basically stopped for a while and is fairly safe. And you kind of hear about his journey, his adventures through the Mediterranean with the monsters, through him telling another character about those things. So very, very similar to the Odyssey in that sense. But book 1 sets up, the basic premise, the basic tension of the story, trying to get to Italy to build a home, Juno interfering with getting there, and then landing somewhere where he can safely tell his story. Book 2 is the beginning of him telling that narrative. And so, of course, the first thing he tells about is the fall of Troy. And this is the book that, like I said, has just the the beautifully bleak descriptions of the fall and destruction of Troy, which is really mind blowing. Book 3 is not in our textbook, but that's where he tells her about the rest of his journey around the Mediterranean, and it's just such a nod to Homer. I know you didn't get to read book 3, but it's just like this fanboy book. Like Aeneas is going around the Mediterranean after he leaves Troy before he gets to Carthage, and he goes by Scylla and Charybdis, and he encounters the same Cyclops as Odysseus, who's of course still alive because Odysseus blinded him. He didn't kill him, but and Aeneas and his men, of course, have to fight off the same Cyclops, the same exact one, Polyphemus, and escape. So book 3 is not in here. It's not quite as important as the other ones because it's just kind of this chronicling of kind of episodic adventures that are very reminiscent of Odysseus' adventures from the Odyssey. But book 4 is probably the most famous book because by then he's finished his narrative, and Aeneas and Dido actually have a relationship. There's even an allusion where they take refuge in the cave from the storm that insinuates they had an intimate relationship. And Cupid, at the end of book 1, tempts Dido, and she falls madly in love with Aeneas, and you can tell Aeneas really cares for her too. And but he can't stay in Carthage because Aeneas and Dido have so much in common. Dido is building her own city, building a new home after a tragic past, much like Aeneas. And so they can't be together because they both have the same goal, and it's not a mutual goal. They each want to build and rule their own city. They can't build the same city because it means too much each to them personally to have to build their own city, build their own new home after having lost their previous home to tragedy. And so he has to go. It's this duty. This is where pietist duty really comes into play in book 4. He has to leave, continue to try to find Italy so that he can found Rome. But Dido, because she's been struck by Cupid and is so madly in love with Aeneas, as hard as it is for him to leave, he hasn't been struck by Cupid. It's not only hard for her to be separated from him, it's impossible. So she commits suicide. And it's incredibly tragic. Much like book 2, you see Aeneas is sailing away, and he looks back and he sees the fire from Dido's, the flames, the smoke and the flames in the air from Dido's funeral pyre, and he doesn't fully grasp what's going on. It's incredibly tragic and sad. And like book 2, it's reminiscent of the fall of Troy in that sense, where Virgil just has this ability as a poet, this gift to describe incredibly tragic and sad things in a beautiful way. So that's why book 4 is so famous. Then book 5 is the funeral games in Sicily. It's very similar to book 8 in the Odyssey, where Odysseus competes in the physical contest, and this is to honor the death of Aeneas' father, who did make it out of Troy with Aeneas and his son, but who passed on their journey, and it's been a year since he passed. And this is one of their last stops before they arrive in Italy. And again, this book is kind of minor compared to the other one, so it's not included in our textbook. And then book 6, I apologize. He travels to the underworld. So this is also included in our textbook and is a great scene because he is very similar, reminiscent to Odysseus' journey to the underworld in book 11, and he gets to see people who've died. He even sees Dido, and this deepens the themes of book 4 because they're not able to reconcile. She hasn't really forgiven him yet, so it's a powerful book as well. And so our textbook included book 1, 2, 3, or books 1, 2, 4, and 6, which I know is quite a lot of reading. So I appreciate you doing that. I hope you got a lot out of them. And then after the journey to the underworld, they do indeed arrive in Italy. So books 7 through 12 are the war in Italy, where Aeneas arrives. He meets a group of local people called the Latiums, and he's betrothed to Lavinia, the king's daughter. But a local man also from another local tribe, the Rutuli, is also in love with her, and so there's a war basically, and the Aeneid literally ends with um, Aeneas killing his opponent, defeating the Rutuli, and triumphing in war. So we don't see the founding of Rome, we don't see his marriage to Lavinia, but we know these things happen, and so the destruction of his rival at the end of Book 12 is really what symbolically represents the founding of Rome. And so you see this man who, for 6 books, kicks around the Mediterranean, much like Odysseus, but rather than arriving home alone, he arrives in a new land with his followers, with his soldiers, and founds a home there. And you couldn't tell the whole story in 12 books, but you can see how this defeating of his rival at the end of Book 12 gestures toward the founding, the building of a new home. It represents, now that he's landed in the new land and defeated his rival, he will build the new home. And that's what's made this story the national epic of Rome. So the Romans really love books 7 through 12, but books 1 through 6, because of the relationship with Dido, the fall of Troy, those kinds of things, those are the ones that are more psychologically interesting to study the characters and whatnot, and why modern scholars have leaned into studying the early books more, even though books 7 and 12 would have been really compelling to Virgil's contemporary Roman audience at the time. So, moving along here, my first question to discuss the content of the story is the same one I always ask. What do you think of the protagonist? And this time, I would compare him to not just, all of the protagonists we've studied so far, male and female, but also specifically in really close detail, Achilles and Odysseus, because he is... because Virgil draws on Homer so much. And I can only fit so much on a PowerPoint slide, but one thing that's unique about this text is, like I said before, the language is so beautiful. So I actually want to read you some longer passages of it that really set the stage for the story. And the first line is one of my favorite lines in all of literature, because Aeneas experiences so much. He loses his wife. He travels so far to build a new home. He commits his own sins, like he does against Dido, but he continues to try to build this new home. And so I just love this first line. Wars and a man I sing. That is beautiful poetry. But let me go ahead and read the rest. Wars and a man I sing, an exile driven on by fate. He was the first to flee the coast of Troy, destined to reach Lavinian shores and Italian soil. Yet many blows he took on land and sea from the gods above, thanks to cruel Juno's relentless rage, and many losses he bore in battle too. Before he could found a city, bring his gods to Latium, source of the Latin race, the Alban lords and the high walls of Rome. Tell me, Muse, how it all began. Why was Juno outraged? What could wound the queen of the gods with all her power? Why did she force a man so famous for his devotion to brave such rounds of hardship, bear such trials? Can such rage inflame the immortals' hearts? There was an ancient city held by Tyrrhenian settlers, Carthage, facing Italy in the Tiber River's mouth, but far away, a rich city trained and fierce in war. Juno loved it, they say, beyond all other lands. In the world, even beloved Samos second best. Here she kept her armor, here her chariot too, and Carthage would rule the nations of the earth if only the fates were willing. This was Juno's goal from the start, and so she nursed her city's strength. But she heard a race of men, sprung of Trojan blood, would one day topple down her Tyrrhenian stronghold, breed an arrogant people ruling far and wide, proud in battle, destined to plunder Libya. So the fates were spinning out the future. This was Juno's fear, and the goddess never forgot the old campaign that she had waged at Troy for her beloved Argos. No, not even now would the causes of her rage, her bitter sorrows, drop from the goddess's mind. They festered deep within her, galled her still. The judgment of Paris, the unjust slight to her beauty, the Trojan stock she loathed, the honors showered on Ganymede, ravished on the skies. Her fury inflamed by all this, the daughter of Saturn, drove over endless oceans. Trojans left by the Greeks and brute Achilles, Juno kept them from Latium, forced by the fates to wander around the seas of the world, year in and year out. Such a long, hard labor it was to found the Roman people. So here you have it. This section sums up so much about the Aeneid. You have wars and a man I sing. So you have this portrait of Aeneas as this long-suffering man with a mission not to get home, but to build a home. So almost like Odysseus with a slight difference. But we already have the allusions here to Carthage. We know it's coming in book 4 with Dido and Carthage. And so we know that, again, like Odysseus, he's not perfect. And then you have, in the second stanza, around line 9, you have, tell me, Muse, how it all began. Why was Juno outraged? And so you have it setting the stage. The first 8 lines describe who Aeneas is, and then the next line says, tell me the story. Give me the background and context. And it says muse. So it's drawing on that Greek tradition, like at the beginning of the Odyssey, where the poet evokes the muses to tell the story or inspire the story. And then it explains why Juno, much like Poseidon in the Odyssey, is enraged at Aeneas. And why is she enraged? Well, he has wronged Carthage and wronged Dido. And so Carthage is the city that Rome would eventually be at war with for years. And so even though this story takes place in the past, it's the mythological past, it's about the founding of Rome. One key difference is the Romans didn't have this oral tradition like the Greeks did that they drew on. That was something I probably should have mentioned earlier. So rather than drawing on their own oral tradition, Virgil's drawing on Greek traditions and reinventing them here for his own purposes and the purposes of Augustus the emperor. And so at the time Virgil was writing this, Rome was embroiled in war with Carthage. And so even though it takes place in the past, this setting of Carthage would have resonated with Virgil's contemporary audience at the time. And so by kind of pitting Aeneas against the Carthaginians here, he's Virgil's setting up a paradigm that would very much resonate with his modern readers and emphasize the ideas of duty and allegiance to the empire and the need to spread the empire by conquering other nations like Carthage. But Juno is the antagonist here, right? The goddess who, like Poseidon, is making Aeneas' journey difficult. So she is aligned with the enemy, with Carthage. It's the city that she favors and loves. So because she knows Aeneas is going to wrong Dido and pay this sin against Carthage, she despises Aeneas. And also he's a Trojan. And if you think back to the Iliad, right? Paris was supposed to judge the beauty of the 3 goddesses, and the one he picked gave him Helen as a prize, and that launched the Trojan War. We just reviewed that in studying Agamemnon last time. So here it comes up again because you translate Juno from the Greek. She was she was Hera in Greek mythology. Like they just changed the names of the gods. But Athena won the beauty contest. Paris picked Athena, and Athena gave him Helen as a prize, and that launched the Trojan War. So Hera, now Juno, because she's been converted from Greece to Rome, is still jealous of Paris, the Trojan prince, Paris, picking Athena over her. And so she hates the Trojan race. So she supports Carthage, she hates Troy. And so you've got really clearly delineated battle lines, you could say, in this stanza. These 3 stanzas here, these first 40 or so lines of the poem. And so you really see how this is like kind of furthering the message of the empire. And that comes through most clearly in the final line here. Such a long, hard labor it was to found the Roman people. That line in and of itself could sum up the Aeneid. It's all about how hard it was to found the Roman Empire, and against to rouse up support for the emperor. And so these first passages really show how, on the one hand, with a line like, such a long, hard labor it was to found the Roman people. So on the one hand, with a line like that, you can see how this is like propaganda. But compare that to the first line, wars and a man I sing, you see how it's not as simple as propaganda. There's a psychological depth here to Aeneas, and Virgil, despite kind of spewing some propaganda, he's at the same time also giving us a beautiful, complex, challenging story. And as we move forward and look at some of the other characters, we can see how that happens. And one of the ways this happens most is in Book 2, when we see the fall of Troy. Because this is amazing. This is it's difficult to read. It's challenging because you're seeing people dying and buildings burning as the Greek soldiers come out of the Trojan horse. We see something Homer never showed us in the Iliad, but that we know about from Greek mythology. And so what Virgil does here is interesting, is show us kind of the other perspective. Like in the last thing we read in Book 1, he's showing us a conquering people, like the brave, heroic, conquering Roman people. But here he's showing what it's like to be conquered. And that's what makes Aeneas complex. He's not just a conqueror who's going to found a new empire. He comes from a land that was conquered by the Greeks. He's a man who lost his original home. And so you put Book 1 and 2 together, and you get kind of that comparison again of the imperial propaganda combined with the psychological complexity of the characters. And so I ask you now to consider the episode of the Trojan horse from Book 2, which describes the Greek battle with the Trojans very differently than the Iliad does. And what are we learning here from this? And so I'm going to read to you again. This is one of the most beautiful passages. And it's where it's right at the end. I'm going to actually read from about line 956 to the end of Book 2. A good amount here, about 40 lines again. But this is where he finds his wife and realizes it's the ghost of his wife, and she can't come with him. But then as I madly rushed from house to house, no end in sight, abruptly, right before my eyes, I saw her stricken ghost, my own Creusa's shade. But larger than life, the life I'd known so well, I froze. My hackles bristled, voice choked in my throat, and my wife spoke out to ease me of my anguish. My dear husband, why so eager to give yourself to such mad flights of grief? It's not without the will of the gods these things have come to pass, but the gods forbid you to take Creusa with you, bound from Troy together. The king of lofty Olympus won't allow it. A long exile is your fate. The vast plains of the sea are yours to plow, until you reach Hesperian land, where Lydian Tiber flows with its smooth march through rich and loamy fields, a land of hardy people. There, great joy and a kingdom are yours to claim, and a queen to make your wife. Dispel your tears for Creusa, whom you loved. I will never behold the high and mighty pride of their palaces, the Myrmidons, the Dolopians, or go as a slave to some Greek matron. No, not I. Daughter of Dardanus, that I am the wife of Venus' son, the great mother of gods that tames me on these shores. And now farewell, hold dear the son we share, we love together. These were her parting words, and for all my tears, I longed to say so much. Dissolving into the empty air, she left me now. 3 times I tried to fling my arms around her neck. 3 times I embraced nothing. Her phantom, sifting through my fingers, light as wind, quick as a dream in flight. Gone. And at last the night was over. Back I went to my people, and I was amazed to see what throngs of new companions had poured in to swell our numbers. Mothers, men, our forces gathered for exile, grieving masses. They had come together from every quarter, belongings, spirits ready for me to lead them over the sea to whatever lands I'd choose. And now the morning star was mounting above, the high crests of Ida, leading on the day. The Greeks had taken the city, blocked up every gate. No hope of rescue now. So I gave way at last, and lifting my father, headed toward the mountains. So here we see less propaganda and more psychological depth. We see the pain. He's only able to see the ghost of his wife, not actually see his wife. He has to leave her behind, and because she's gone, and he has to leave his home. But what's amazing is, one, she kind of spurs him on. She tells him, this is not your fate. Your fate is to marry again, to build a new home. But take our son, who we love, together. And so, to me, that's one of the joys of this text, is that Aeneas' son is with him, even though he's lost his wife, and go build this new home. And then he sees, even though he's lost his wife, he sees people. Those last about 15 lines, he sees his people. Gone, at last the night was over. Back I went to my people, and I was amazed to see what throngs of new companions had poured in to swell our numbers. Mothers, men, our forces gathered for exile, grieving masses. So he's assembled a fleet of people, and they sail off. So like Odysseus, he's wandering around the Mediterranean after this, but unlike Odysseus, he's not going home, he's going to build a new home. And he has all kinds of people with him who make it there, a people to found a new home. So before we move on to the discussion board questions, we have to take a look at Dido. Dido is probably the most fascinating character in the text. And she is this powerful figure. It'd be wonderful to compare her with Penelope and Antigone and Clytemnestra and Lysistrata and the other female characters we've read, because she's incredibly strong and powerful and independent. And unfortunately, the gods choose to make her dependent on Aeneas, and that's her undoing. So she becomes this incredibly tragic figure, both powerful and tragic. And so she's probably the most famous figure from this famous poem. But let's take a look at kind of a description of her. And one thing I'll note real quickly is a lot of scholars have compared her to Cleopatra, right? Kind of like Rome didn't have the same rich mythology to draw on that Greece did. They borrowed from the Greeks. But one figure that was part of their mythology was Cleopatra, who was, again, this powerful woman. But, her relationship with Antony was kind of her undoing. And Augustus had to defeat her in order to claim the throne. And so you see some parallels here. But what I think is really fascinating is, like, Augustus had to defeat Cleopatra to gain the throne, right? So that's the parallel. But Virgil doesn't just have Aeneas defeating this woman. It's tragic. Aeneas is in love with her. He can't stay as much as he wants to. He has his duty. And then she commits suicide. So it's very different than defeat in battle. And so Virgil, he takes what the emperor wants him to write, then he adds this psychological depth and complexity to it. So here's the passage. Dido was married to Zacchaeus, the richest man in Tyre, and she, poor girl, was consumed with love for him. Her father gave her away, wed for the first time, a virgin still, and these her first solemn rites. But her brother held power in Tyre, Pygmalion, a monster, the vilest man alive. A murderous feud broke out between both men. Pygmalion, catching Zacchaeus off guard at the altar, slaughtered him in blood. The unholy man, so blind, in his lust for gold, he ran him through with a sword, and hid the crime for months, deaf to his sister's love, her heartbreak. Still he mocked her with wicked lies, with empty hopes. But she had a dream one night. The true ghost of her husband, not yet buried, came, and lifting his face, ashen, awesome in death, showed her the cruel altar, the wounds that pierced his chest, and exposed the secret horror that lurked within the house. He urged her on, take flight from her homeland quick. And then he revealed an unknown ancient treasure, an untold weight of silver and gold, a comrade to speed her on her way. And so the reason I picked this passage is it shows how powerful Dido is, that she's able to rally from this tragic background and go on to found a city, Carthage. But it also shows the parallels between Aeneas and Dido. right? They both lost their spouse. They both lost their home. They both see the ghost of their spouse, and that ghost spurs them on to go found a new home. I mean, it's the same story, basically. And that is, in addition to duty, why I think it's a struggle for them to be together. They're too similar. And so you can involve the gods, Cupid's arrow, you can involve duty, you can say that Cupid's arrow is why Dido falls in love with Aeneas, and you can say duty, pietas is why Aeneas leaves, but I have to wonder if the same things wouldn't have happened anyway, because I feel like they would have been so drawn together because they're so similar, but that ultimately they wouldn't have made it for the long haul because they're so similar. And so this, to me, is where you really see the depth and the power of the Aeneid. All right, discussion questions. So I'm building right on what we just talked about with Dido. Is this a positive or negative representation of femininity? Does it uphold or challenge kind of the male-centric standards of the day? It's a question we've asked about a lot of texts, and we see it here with Dido, again, because she's powerful but limited at the same time. And again, building on that question, how does Aeneas' choice to abandon Dido influence our impression of his character? He's a very likable character, right? Of wars and a man I sing. We just read about the loss of his first wife. So there's a lot of sympathy for him, but he abandons this woman and then she kills herself. So it's a human character. You know, Virgil isn't making anything easy on us. He's forcing us to be demanding readers, when we think about Aeneas. And of course, what role does pietas or duty play in this decision, right? He wants to stay there and be with Dido, but he knows that's not his mission. And his first wife has given him this mission. So again, talking about Carthage, the events of Book 4 would evoke for Roman readers the empire's recent defeat of Carthage. But Dido is just beginning to build her city. This creates a temporal paradox where Virgil tells history in the future tense. In what ways does Virgil use history throughout the text? So I alluded to this earlier, but Virgil is playing with history. He could have made the battle, or it's not even a battle, it's a conflict between Rome and Carthage, here embodied between Troy or Aeneas and Carthage, with a different nation, but he chose Carthage because of Rome's recent defeat of Carthage. So it glorifies the empire the way Augustus wanted the poem to do, but it does so by playing fast and loose with history. So what do you think of this, and what other ways does Virgil use history throughout the text? Next up, imperialism. You'll probably have to define this word to answer this question, but imperialism is the forcible conquering of other countries and basically forcibly taking that country and incorporating it into your own empire to expand your empire, what Rome did to Carthage. And so I ask, is the Aeneid a pro or anti-imperialist text? This might be the most central or important question, because Augustus wanted it to be like this pro-imperial text, like go Rome. But Virgil's just too good of a writer to be constrained by that. And so it certainly has its pro-imperialist moments. I read some of them to you a few minutes ago. But at the same time, you see the fall of Troy. Dido's death is not something we just chalk up as a victory. It's not remotely close to that. It's a tragic, mournful loss, not just for her, not just for us, but for Aeneas as well. And so what do you think? Pro or anti-imperialist, or some of both? And finally, what ways do you see nation building as an important theme here? So, like, I've talked about it. I've talked about how this became the national epic, what Augustus wanted it to be. But where do you see that? Where does that actually show up in the text? So, a lot of interesting things to think about with the Aeneid. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I look forward to reading your thoughts on it.